The Horn of Africa, a region where chaos and opportunity converge, is shrouded in the shadow of two underground forces, Al-Shabaab, a notorious terrorist organization with extremist political ambitions, and the Ethiopian Mafia, a sophisticated criminal network silently manipulating global smuggling routes. One employs overt, brutal violence, while the other brings silent but equally dangerous destruction. What fuels their power? And what is the real threat to the future of this region? Let's uncover the answers. Hidden in the shadows of the Horn of Africa, two organizations, Al-Shabaab and the Ethiopian Mafia, have built distinctly different systems of power. On one side is a tightly knit military machine driven by religious ideology. On the other is a flexible criminal network unbound by any ideology but deeply embedded in the global underground economy. The question arises: what is the optimal organizational structure for maintaining power? And what allows them to persist in an ever-changing world? For Al-Shabaab, the organization operates based on a highly centralized power system. At its core are spiritual leaders and strategists, often selected from the most loyal members of the movement. They determine overall strategies, from recruiting fighters and allocating resources to directing terrorist campaigns. From this power center, Al-Shabaab divides its forces into smaller groups, each tasked with specific objectives such as military attacks, financial gathering, or managing controlled territories. This model allows them to maintain discipline and coordinate efficiently across organizational units. However, this centralization is not without risks. In recent years, targeted campaigns against Al-Shabaab's leaders have created significant challenges. Each time a senior leader is eliminated, the organization faces temporary chaos before restructuring. This heavy reliance on key figures makes Al-Shabaab more vulnerable to decapitation strategies, a term used to describe the removal of an organization's key leaders. In contrast, the Ethiopian Mafia is not bound by a centralized power system. It operates as a decentralized network, built on family ties, allied groups, or temporary partnerships. Each group operates independently, self-managing and accountable for its own profits, but loosely connected to others through economic agreements or kinship. This flexibility makes the Ethiopian Mafia a hard-to-pinpoint network. Even when one branch is dismantled, others remain unaffected and continue their operations with minimal disruption. This structure provides the Ethiopian Mafia with a significant advantage in adapting to new challenges. They do not need to uphold an ideology or maintain a public image. Instead, they operate like predators, silently evolving and growing based on opportunities and threats in their environment. This explains why the Ethiopian Mafia has been able to endure for so long and even expand its influence beyond Africa, with human trafficking and drug routes extending into Europe. But when weighed against each other, what makes one organization stronger than the other? Al-Shabaab, with its centralized power, creates a unified force capable of executing complex strategies and controlling large territories. However, this unity also makes them vulnerable to efforts targeting their leadership structure. The Ethiopian Mafia, while lacking a clear headquarters, survives as a system with no central weakness. Any branch that is cut off can be replaced or regenerated quickly. It's worth noting that the structure of each organization reflects not just how they operate but also how they adapt to their surroundings. Al-Shabaab relies on ideology to bind its members and maintain loyalty, while the Ethiopian Mafia depends on economic incentives to keep its groups cooperating. These are two entirely different philosophies, yet both have proven remarkably effective at consolidating power. So, what could potentially dismantle these systems? For Al-Shabaab, internal dissent or a loss of ideological credibility could spell trouble. If people in areas they control begin rejecting harsh Sharia laws, the group may lose community support. For the Ethiopian Mafia, the main threat would come from cutting off their primary profit sources, such as human trafficking or drug smuggling, through more effective international campaigns. However, with its decentralized nature and adaptability, the Ethiopian Mafia appears to have an edge in weathering such challenges. Ultimately, the question is not just which organization is stronger but which organizational structure is better suited to survive in the unstable environment of the Horn of Africa. Can Al-Shabaab's centralization and discipline maintain its power under continuous pressure? Or will the Ethiopian Mafia's flexibility and decentralization allow it to endure any hardship? This is not only a strategic question but also a lesson in how power structures operate in a world filled with instability and opportunity. In the world of crime and power, objectives not only serve as the guiding star for all actions but also provide the very reason for an organization's existence. For Al-Shabaab and the Ethiopian Mafia, their operational goals differ fundamentally in nature, reflecting how each organization shapes its strategies to survive and thrive. One seeks territorial domination and ideological supremacy, while the other relentlessly pursues profit at any cost. But what makes the goals of each organization unique? And how do they derive their distinct power from their ambitions? Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization with regional prominence, has a grand ambition to establish an Islamic State in Somalia and neighboring regions, where Sharia law is enforced to the fullest extent. For them, this is not merely a political goal but a sacred mission tied to an extremist religious ideology. This ambition propels them into a continuous war against the Somali government, international forces, and even local communities that do not adhere to their strict rules. These goals are not just theoretical but are executed through concrete actions. One of Al-Shabaab's core strategies is territorial control. They seize rural areas where the central government's reach is limited and transform these regions into bases for military and financial operations. Within these territories, Al-Shabaab enforces its own legal system based on Sharia law and imposes heavy taxation on local populations. Tragically, for many communities abandoned by the government, this system, despite its brutality, offers a semblance of stability compared to the previous chaos. But is this truly stability, or merely oppression disguised as order and religion? In stark contrast to Al-Shabaab, the Ethiopian Mafia has no aspirations to control territory or impose ideology. Instead, they operate as an unrelenting money-making machine with a single goal: maximizing profit. For the Ethiopian Mafia, no boundary is insurmountable if the rewards are high enough. From human trafficking, drug smuggling, and arms dealing to money laundering, they constantly seek opportunities to expand their network and strengthen their financial flow. What sets them apart is their lack of political or religious constraints, making them more flexible and unpredictable in their methods. Human trafficking is one of the Ethiopian Mafia's primary activities, and it is also the source of their fearsome reputation. Thousands of desperate people, lured by the dream of a better life in Europe, fall into their traps. Journeys through the Sahara Desert or across the Mediterranean Sea are fraught with danger, where many are exploited, abandoned, or even killed. To the Ethiopian Mafia, human beings are not valued as individuals but as commodities generating immense profit. What's remarkable is that this goal frees the Ethiopian Mafia from the need to create a legitimate or official image. Unlike Al-Shabaab, they have no need to control territory or provide services to local communities. Instead, they operate in the shadows, exploiting the weaknesses of international legal systems and the enormous demand for cheap labor, drugs, and weapons. The absence of ideological constraints enables the Ethiopian Mafia to choose targets and methods without limitation. But when comparing the two organizations, which goals pose a greater threat? Al-Shabaab, with its political and religious ambitions, presents an immediate danger to regional stability. Their terrorist attacks not only cause human casualties but also undermine efforts to build peace and rebuild Somalia. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian Mafia, though less publicly visible, creates a chain of silent tragedies no less horrifying. Their human trafficking and illicit activities devastate families, degrade communities, and fuel humanitarian crises that the world struggles to address. However, what's more thought-provoking is how the goals of each organization reflect their relationship with the surrounding environment. Al-Shabaab thrives on political instability, the weakness of central governance, and the blind loyalty of members driven by extremist ideology. The Ethiopian Mafia, on the other hand, leverages globalization, gaps in international legal systems, and the insatiable demands of the black market. This makes them two different symbols of the same larger issue: the failure of political and economic systems to protect the most vulnerable. So, how can these goals be countered? One side requires ideological disarmament to weaken its propaganda and territorial control, while the other needs its economic networks dismantled to disrupt revenue streams. But is this feasible? Or have both organizations become too deeply embedded in the current structures of power and economy? These are questions with no easy answers, sparking an ongoing debate about how the world should respond to these two opposing yet equally dangerous forces. If goals serve as the compass guiding all actions, the nature of their crimes is the clearest manifestation of how each organization achieves its ambitions. While Al-Shabaab chooses overt violence to instill fear, the Ethiopian Mafia operates silently but no less ruthlessly. What makes these two organizations symbolic of contrasting forms of crime? And what are the real differences in how they harm society? Al-Shabaab, known globally as one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the region, uses terrorism as its primary weapon to achieve political and religious goals. Each attack carries a clear message: to sow fear and assert dominance. Iconic examples include suicide bombings at shopping centers, schools, and churches, causing horrific casualties and destroying symbols of stability. One of the most notable incidents was the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya, where dozens lost their lives in mere hours. These acts are not just atrocities but direct challenges to security forces and the international community. However, public violence is only part of Al-Shabaab's operations. Behind the terrorism lies a complex network of criminal activities that sustain their resources. They smuggle charcoal, exploit natural resources illegally, and even engage in trafficking rare wildlife. These smuggling routes not only fund the organization but also entrench them in the global underground economy. For people living under Al-Shabaab's control, these activities translate into endless exploitation. Impoverished families are forced to pay war taxes, and small businesses are coerced into providing free resources or labor. Those who resist often face death. In contrast, the Ethiopian Mafia employs an entirely different approach, avoiding public violence while leaving deeper scars through global-scale illicit activities. One of their most notorious operations is human trafficking, particularly targeting desperate individuals seeking escape from poverty and war. Promises of a better life in Europe lure thousands into their traps. However, the journey across the Sahara Desert or the Mediterranean Sea often comes at the cost of lives. Survivors are frequently sold into slavery or fall into the hands of other criminal groups at their destinations. The Ethiopian Mafia's reach extends far beyond human trafficking. The organization is heavily involved in drug and arms smuggling, as well as money laundering. These activities generate enormous profits but also destabilize the regions where they operate. Imagine a struggling community now grappling with a surge in addiction due to cheap drugs introduced by the Ethiopian Mafia. Consider the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of power struggles among criminal factions, where human lives are reduced to mere numbers in illicit transactions. The stark contrast between these two organizations lies not only in their methods but also in the scale of their impacts. Al-Shabaab inflicts visible, immediate harm through acts of terror, while the Ethiopian Mafia sows silent but pervasive destruction. A terrorist attack might shock the world, but the thousands who perish in the desert or are sold into slavery often go unnoticed in daily news. The quiet nature of the Ethiopian Mafia's operations doesn't diminish their threat. It makes them harder to detect and combat. But which form of crime is more dangerous? This is a challenging question. Al-Shabaab, with its public violence, forces governments and the international community to take immediate action. Yet the Ethiopian Mafia, with its sophistication and global network, not only harms local communities but also undermines international economic and legal systems. Their existence exposes a harsh reality: not all damage is seen or addressed promptly. Juxtaposing these two organizations offers a broader lesson about the nature of crime. Al-Shabaab represents unmasked brutality, where violence is both a tool and a symbol. The Ethiopian Mafia, in contrast, embodies sophistication, with illegal operations concealed under the guise of legitimacy and cross-border transactions. Despite their differences, both leave indelible scars on the regions they operate in, presenting enormous challenges to efforts in justice and human rights protection. What's most alarming is how these organizations reflect the world's inability to tackle complex issues effectively. While the international community focuses its energy on defeating Al-Shabaab through military campaigns, the Ethiopian Mafia quietly expands its influence, silently destroying thousands of lives without making headlines. This is not just a story of two criminal organizations but a wake-up call. Do we truly understand and possess the capacity to confront these volatile threats? As the story of Al-Shabaab and the Ethiopian Mafia unfolds, touching on organizational structures, operational goals, and the nature of their crimes, it emerges as a multi-dimensional portrait. Here, threats not only exist but intertwine, creating a complex vortex in the Horn of Africa. The larger question, one that challenges anyone reflecting on this issue, is: does the world truly understand the essence of these two organizations? And which threat should take priority? This is not merely a strategic puzzle but also a question of responsibility and ethics. Let's begin with Al-Shabaab. Every action of this organization directly targets regional stability. They are not merely a terrorist group but also a political force, a counterweight to Somalia's government and international alliances. Al-Shabaab's devastating bombings not only kill but undermine confidence in the government's ability to protect its people. Their targets are symbols of stability: schools, shopping centers, and even African Union offices. Each act sends a clear message: they not only exist but challenge every effort to suppress them. More striking is how Al-Shabaab integrates itself into rural life. For many living in remote, neglected areas abandoned by the central government, Al-Shabaab is not just a terrorist group but also a governing entity. They provide basic services, from resolving disputes through Sharia courts to maintaining security in their controlled areas. For communities with no alternatives, the stability Al-Shabaab offers, despite its oppressive nature, can sometimes be the only option. This dual role makes the organization more than just a violent force. It roots itself deeply in vulnerable communities, creating a system that is both an enemy and a refuge. On the other hand, the Ethiopian Mafia operates silently but no less fearfully. Unlike Al-Shabaab, it requires no acknowledgement or support from any community. The Ethiopian Mafia thrives as an invisible entity, exploiting the opportunities globalization provides. It capitalizes on weak borders, poor international cooperation, and the helplessness of vulnerable communities to build a global criminal network. Take human trafficking as an example. The Ethiopian Mafia not only exploits the dreams of thousands of Africans but turns them into nightmares. The trafficking routes across the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean are testaments to their ruthlessness and efficiency. With every death along the journey, with every family losing a loved one, the Ethiopian Mafia grows richer. What's more terrifying is how they turn devastated communities into unwilling cogs in their criminal machine. Local people are coerced into becoming accomplices, offering shelter or transporting victims. This not only fractures communities but makes dismantling the Ethiopian Mafia nearly impossible. So, which threat is greater? Al-Shabaab, with its overt acts of terrorism, or the Ethiopian Mafia, with its silent yet persistent destruction? The answer isn't straightforward, as each poses distinct challenges to governments and the international community. Al-Shabaab is an acute threat requiring immediate intervention, while the Ethiopian Mafia is a chronic danger that cannot be resolved overnight. Indeed, the Mafia's quiet operations make it even harder to dismantle. Both organizations exploit systemic gaps to survive. For Al-Shabaab, it's the weakness of Somalia's government, regional divisions, and the lack of international consensus. For the Ethiopian Mafia, it's globalization, where resources move effortlessly across borders. Smuggling routes stretch from Africa to Europe, and illicit profits are laundered through legitimate businesses. Each is a lesson in how the modern world, no matter how developed, leaves gaps large enough for criminal organizations to exploit. But this discussion cannot end with identifying the problems. The bigger question is, what will we do to confront these forces? Can regional governments unite to counter Al-Shabaab? Or will local interests continue to hinder collective efforts? Will the international community invest in dismantling the Ethiopian Mafia? Or will they focus only on more visible threats like terrorism? This is not just about strategy but a test of the world's will and responsibility in facing the era's most significant challenges. The stories of Al-Shabaab and the Ethiopian Mafia are not just tales of two criminal organizations but reminders that injustice, inequality, and chaos remain fertile grounds for crime. Can the world do better to eliminate these conditions? Or will shadows like Al-Shabaab and the Ethiopian Mafia continue to overshadow neglected lands? The story of Al-Shabaab and the Ethiopian Mafia is not just about the Horn of Africa but also a reflection of deeper issues in a world riddled with inequality and chaos. One organization relies on violence to impose power, while the other uses sophistication to manipulate and profit. Yet both leave indelible scars on the lands they control. Ultimately, the question is not just which is more dangerous, but what we, governments, international organizations, and individuals, will do to confront these shadows. Is it time to break the cycle of neglect and exploitation to bring hope to a region brimming with potential but never truly valued?